Kantipur Conclave.
So this session is titled or themed, Where is the Money? I think a lot of us would be very alert in this session to find out answers to the questions for the theme that this session has been set upon. Jim Rogers, a prominent American investor, said, if you were smart in 1807, you moved to London. If you were smart in 1907, you moved to New York. And if you are smart in 2007, you moved to Asia. We have seen many such moves taken by people, and it has been a very smart and successful moves for many. Nepal, our beautiful country, is also in Asia, and we have been talking about how Nepal is ready for investments, the potential that it has, and the benefits that the investors can get. To moderate this session, Where is the Money?, we have Mr. Siddhant Pandey, who is the chairman and CEO of Business Oxygen Pvt Limited, the first international SME venture private equity impact fund for Nepal. He's also someone who's left the international banking scene to do something in Nepal, someone who is continuously exploring areas of investment and pushing for more investments into Nepal. So I request our moderator, Mr. Siddhant Pandey, to kindly take the session forward.
Thank you, Sadisha. A very good morning to you for attending this session. Where's the money? I mean, I think we all ask that question to ourselves every morning when we get up, but today we'll be discussing this on a larger macro level. Now, Nepal has made incredible inroads when it's come to the social and political arenas. Our Human Development Index has been incredibly attractive. In politics, we're no longer in conflict. We're a post-conflict nation. We've had our constitution. We, for the first time in decades, have a political system with a government with a two-third majority. But where have we sort of not quite made it up to the mark? It's the economy. It's where the money seems not to be filtering in. So today, we have an incredible group of panelists here. From the private as well as the public sector, multilateral, most of them actually represent the multilateral organizations. To give things in perspective of why the money factor is very important, let me sort of talk a little bit about what is needed by the time we reach 2030. To meet SDG goals, we need $20 billion per year. SDG goals are to be realized in the year 2030. And of that 20 billion, 55% of it is meant to be covered by the government. The 45% has to be covered by the private sector. Now, to actually reach those goals, we need to prop up the private sector. And we also need to have our economy grow at a GDP rate of 7%. For that, you need investments of $2 billion. And for that, you need FDI. And considering the region, we are probably the least attractive nation in terms of foreign direct investment. Now, I hope from the discourse that we come up with today and the solutions will be that we do reach that level of some sort of answers to the question of where the money is. And there are a lot of factors that are in play here. So I'm going to start off with Bhoj Raj Poudel, who is an economist. He is with the Asian Development Bank on secondment with the Ministry of Finance. So my first question is, Bhoj Raj, what do you think policy and regulation reforms are very important? There are 17 outstanding policy and reforms that are that needed to be advocated to be implemented before the investment summit. What do you think in terms of representing or being a part of a multilateral organization? What is your role in advising for this to happen?
Thank you, Siddhanti.
I'm Bhoj Raj Poudel, currently working with Ministry of Finance as a project management specialist. My role at the Ministry of Finance is to build a trust environment between Asian Development Bank and the Ministry of Finance. The core of the task entails pushing forward some of the key policy reforms. The one is Public-Private Partnership Bill, which the government introduced Public-Private Partnership Policy in 2015. But taking up from there, the government has recently submitted the bill to the Parliament, hoping to be endorsed by the Parliament before the investment summit. The second task entails of developing an integrated public debt act in the context of federalism. The government has established a dedicated public debt management office, which will be bringing all the front, middle, and back office of the debt management under one roof. The practice that is globally considered as efficient one. Once we have the Public Debt Act endorsed from the Parliament, that will lay the foundation for central, provincial, and local governments to use the capital market to finance infrastructures ranging from small, medium to large scale projects. Particularly question that comes from Siddhantji regarding 17 policy reforms that needs to be done before the investment summit. There is a high-level committee chaired by Finance Minister Dr. Yuvraj Khatioda, and as far as I know, working with the officials from the Ministry of Finance, Planning Commission, Investment Board, and other line ministries, the task of getting these bills endorsed from the Parliament is accelerated, putting much effort, particularly from the Investment Board side. From the Ministry of Finance side, these two bills, as I said, the Public-Private Partnership Bill, Public Debt Act, and one more that is not yet finalized but is being discussed within the institutions is an act related to mega projects, where a high-level committee will be instrumental to order any institutions at any point to untangle the bottlenecks for the infrastructure developments.
Thank you, Bhoj. I know we are keenly looking at especially the execution of the FITA, Foreign Investment Technology Transfer Act, which is going to be an important foundation for, I think, for the success of the investment summit. But now I'm going to move to the other multilateral organization. Faris Hadad Zervos is the country manager of the World Bank group in Nepal. He has been in Bolivia, Iraq, as well as Malaysia. Faris, World Bank is probably the largest committer of capital to Nepal, with $2.6 billion in 25 projects. World Bank has been extremely instrumental in policy matters, directing the government. Now, in terms of looking at the situation of foreign investment and moving forward, and also to supplement what Bhoj Raj has just said, can you just illuminate us on the role of the World Bank Group in Nepal?
Sure. No, thank you very much. I hope you can hear me. It's always difficult. Yeah, okay, maybe this is the good distance. Well, thank you very much, Sid, for that, and happy to talk about, as you mentioned, the role of the World Bank, which is one of many development partners, of course. We have our colleagues and friends from the ADB and many others who are involved, and certainly I'm very happy to say that this year actually is our 50-year anniversary of working in Nepal as the World Bank Group, which includes the World Bank, of course, and my colleague Aditi here will speak to it from the IFC. So I think we're very much here to support it, because ultimately, if you think, I don't want this, I want to use my very precious time to actually focus on Nepal rather than what the World Bank is doing. But I would just say that insofar as our goal is to support countries and meeting, the twin goals of poverty eradication and achieving shared prosperity, then, our objective in the case of Nepal is actually to support this economic narrative or this economic storyline of growth, sustainable growth through public and private sector engagement. But I think it's really important because, given that this topic is about where's the money and about development and where the money comes in, if you just bear with me a little bit, I think it's very important, and yesterday we heard it from the Right Honorable Prime Minister, from the other speakers, the keynote speakers, and I think this is where an event like the Conclave is very important, is we need to, all of us, develop a common narrative of what is the storyline, what is the economic storyline for Nepal moving forward. And then if we agree on this narrative, and we can disagree on how to achieve that narrative, etc., which is healthy, but we need to sort of really focus on executing this narrative the day after the conclave is finished, which is, I guess tomorrow or Wednesday, tomorrow. So I think it's really important, when somebody says, how's Nepal doing in terms of the investment climate? And my answer would be, depends. What are you looking at? What is the time horizon that you're looking at? If you're looking at between today and tomorrow, today and next week, it's not doing very well. It could do better. It's better than it was before because we have stability, we have a long-term horizon, and we have this prospect and commitment of, the new FITA law, as my colleague was saying, the Foreign Investment and Technology Transfer Act. We have the PPP Investment Act. We have a lot. So it's better than it was, but it's certainly not in a good place. But if we're looking at it from that horizon, then I would suggest you not invest in Nepal. If you're looking at it from a longer-term storyline, which looks at the history of Nepal, where it was, how it evolved through a series of shocks. They could be political, they could be macroeconomic, given that you have many Nepalis working outside, and they could be related to the earthquake and the floods and the trade, the disruptions, etc. Then Nepal is doing quite well, and Nepal has an optimistic future, and a future we should be optimistic in. Even during this period, and I keep saying this myself, this is a new Nepal. It's a new chapter in Nepal's history. But even in the pre-new Nepal, if you look at it, for instance, poverty, extreme poverty has gone down from over 40, 45%, 15%. Headline poverty has gone to 25%. During this period, the bottom 40, the consumption of the bottom 40 in Nepal actually was double that of the top 60. And this was during the bad times. So there is a positive story to tell. Now, having said that, moving forward, there continues to be a lot of issues we need to focus on. This idea of prosperous Nepal and happy Nepal is a very important one. Reaching middle-income country status by 2030 is a very important one. But if you look at that, in order to reach middle-income country status, even at the current growth rates, by 2030 you're likely to be, and I'm looking at my number, $958, which is less than middle-income country status. To achieve middle-income country status, you need at least 8% growth rate on a per annum for the next periods until 2030. For that to happen, you need a massive amount of investment. Investment in infrastructure alone needs to be about 13% of GDP. You currently have it at 4%. The public sector, so this is something that requires the role of the public sector and the private sector to work together. On the public sector side, it's very important to look at public investment management. And why is it that on average, a public infrastructure project in Nepal takes 11 years to complete? Those that to complete take 11 years to complete. Why is that? And for every dollar in public spending, how much do we need to bring in from private sector spending, through foreign investment, through investment by Nepalis abroad, Nepalis here, etc. And this is where the investment climate is very important. We are in a period now where the investment climate is, through a series of laws and a massive commitment, and I have to really applaud them by authorities in the Ministry of Finance and other ministries to bring about these laws to create the right bedrock to develop a new Nepal. This is a necessary but insufficient condition, but I'm not being pessimistic, I'm being very optimistic. This is a necessary condition. Now we need to work on implementation of these laws and making this happen. So I think and then I'll turn. For an investor, I would say, if you're here to come into Nepal at the right time and bring in massive profits over the long term, now is the time to do it. But if you're to get quick results in a year or two, now is not the time.
Thank you, Faris. Yes, patience is a virtue in investment and working in Nepal. And also, you did clearly point out that, platforms like this are not an end in itself, but they are a means to an end. And from tomorrow onwards, whatever has been discussed in these 2 past days need to be implemented and executed. Thank you. Now, before I'd like to skip Aditi to come to Abhishek, because we've had 2 representatives from the multilateral organizations. With Aditi, it would be 3. So just to get a little change, Abhishek Kumar is a IT specialist. He is the, sorry, excuse me, where are we? Sorry. He is the managing partner of Rainforest Ventures. He has many years of experience with IT technology in high growth sectors. Previously, he has worked in positions with Snapdeal as well as Palace Ventures. Now, what I'd like to ask Abhishek is that India in the past 2 decades has made leaps and bounds, especially in attracting FDI. Today, India has even beat China with $38 billion of FDI this year. China is about 34, 35. And the inflections that triggered this sort of growth in India started off with investments in the IT sector. Now, Abhishek, can you please give us your experience of having been a part of that evolution in India and your contributions and what led to the success of what India has culminated in the IT sector today?
Thank you, Siddhant. So, I think if you look at the success, as you mentioned, of India, the success India has had in raising foreign capital, there are 2 phases, right? The first phase started in the late 80s with IT services companies, which we all know about now. So there was Infosys, HCL, Wipro, TCS, and these became very large very quickly, right? Because there was an arbitrage, they had an advantage, and they were solving rest of the world's problems, right? Which much cheaper. The second phase, I think, and that's more important, and that's where I was associated with, was startups, right? You mentioned 38 billion in FDI last year. Startups and high growth companies raised 20 billion out of that, right? So if you add the acquisition of Flipkart for 16 billion, then almost entirely covers that FDI figure, although we don't add that. But and you look back at the evolution of this is the startup ecosystem in India, I would say sometime in the early 2000s, 2005, 6, 7, 8, this is when a lot of these startups were founded, even Flipkart, which got acquired by Walmart recently. And what happened then that didn't happen before that, right? Why did we have an inflection point in the number of startups coming out of India? Of course, them getting funded and raising hundreds of millions of dollars was the headline 5 years later. But initially, I feel, and this is what doesn't get covered much, is the fact that we actually had a very thriving angel investment ecosystem, right? We had a series of former entrepreneurs, former executives of these IT companies, which came up in the 80s and 90s, who now had capital to invest and who were willing to take, as you mentioned, long-term patient bets. And these are not large amounts, right? We hear of, I mean, we went out and raised hundreds of millions of dollars across the world. So the answer to the question, where is the money, is quite simple. I think the question is how to get it. Here, what India did successfully was, I think the government also helped, all the governments since then, is that we let startups develop. We created an ecosystem where they could raise small capital to start off with, angel investment, seed capital. And of course, then the funds came in. There were American funds, there were Chinese funds, and of course now homegrown capital. But I think we can all ask, what can the government do for us? Where can we get money from? I think the answer lies here. I think you need current entrepreneurs, current business families, HNIs, to open up and to start investing in smaller amounts, maybe $100,000 or less, in entrepreneurs they feel have a potential to scale up, scale fast, and execute at scale. I think that doesn't get covered that much in Indian media also and outside India, because it's not sexy enough, right? It's not hundreds of millions of dollars, it's not a multi-billion-dollar exit, but it's very important. That was the foundation of what led to today startups raising, between 15 and 20 billion every year from across the globe.
Thank you, Abhishek. A very important factor here is that a lot of the successful companies in India bootstrap their way into raising funds. And in Nepal, we haven't quite understood that concept, and we feel that investments should come from the investor without actually showing some sort of a track record. But I hope we will be able to in the coming years.
I would just like to add that even, what you should understand as an angel investor is, most asset classes, the returns will flatline over a period of time, whether it's real estate or commodities. Investment in private companies, right, equity of startups, is one asset class throughout the globe which is given disproportionate returns even till date, even in the West, right? You go to the US, you look at equity market returns, bond yields, and the rest, it's nothing. But there are thousands of angel investors investing in Silicon Valley because it still gives a great return. So if you talk purely in financial terms, economic terms, it's a great investment. Yes, the failure rates are high, but then you make more investments. The fact is that unless you do that, capital will follow success, right? You need early success. That's what happened in India. The large funds didn't come to India in 2000, right? It happened later. Once we showed that there were startups with a track record, with early traction, quite successful, but not yet that scale as China or the US then. But they came in later. I think first you need to figure out where is the domestic capital. It's there, right? It has to be invested. It's not being invested, probably being invested in traditional assets. And this is not considered as a viable investment. I think that needs to change.
Just to supplement what you've said in Nepal's context, Nepal is an ideal place to start up a business because the cost of starting a business is nowhere as expensive as it would be anywhere else in the region or abroad. And so the cost of failing, which is eventually going to happen in running a startup business, is not going to be so endearing. Now I'm going to target Aditi. Aditi Shrestha is portfolio officer at the IFC, sister organization of the World Bank Group. IFC has been incredibly active in working with the private sector in Nepal, from working with SMEs to large hydro projects to providing lines of credit to commercial banks for trade purposes. Aditi, where is IFC heading with this?
Thank you, Siddhant. So IFC, as a development financial institution, our investment priorities are driven more by countries' development needs rather than commercial considerations, right? So our investment priorities, given the context of Nepal, has been around infrastructure, which is power, connectivity, financial inclusion, which you know very well about because we work closely with you, around climate smart investments, and also, given Nepal's challenges, sectors that promote competitiveness and job creation. Right now, our portfolio is of around $75 million in terms of investment and advisory, but we have a really robust pipeline, and we have a target of $1 billion in terms of financing facilitated by IFC within the next 3 to 4 years. We work across sectors, but right now, our current exposure is primarily in hydropower and in financial inclusion and financial services. Just to quickly touch upon hydropower, there's a big role for DFIs like IFC to play in this sector because of our ability to mobilize private finance, but also because of our rigorous application of environmental and social standards. We are investing in Upper Trishuli 1, which would be the largest FDI that Nepal has seen. And going forward, we also intend to finance around 1,000 megawatts of hydropower projects. And we also do quite a bit of advisory around hydro. We're working with the Ministry of Environment on environmental standards. We're working with the private sector on both environmental and commercial aspects of hydropower projects as well. If I could talk a little bit also on the financial services side, again, a big exposure there. We work with microfinance institutions and commercial banks, and we have the target of reaching 1 million in terms of unbanked population and 18,000 SMEs through enhanced financial services over the next few years. In terms of microfinance institutions, we have equity investments, and as you mentioned, with commercial banks, we have trade finance lines for risk mitigation and to facilitate international trade. We also have credit lines with these banks so that they can on-lend to SMEs. And as you know, SMEs are very important in Nepal for job creation and also because they are the primary force behind economic growth in Nepal. And of course, I can't forget the work that we do through our SME fund in Nepal. We are invested in Business Oxygen, which you are very familiar with. And Business Oxygen, our fund manager for the IFC SME Ventures Fund, they provide technical assistance and risk capital for SMEs. Again, very important given the large role that SMEs play in the context of Nepal.
Thank you, Aditi. You know, the fact that we really need to demystify this notion that investments should only come into larger projects. Because until recently, with IFC's intervention of creating the first private equity fund for SMEs in Nepal, there really wasn't any capital that could address the missing middle. The small and medium enterprises that could not get bank financing because of lack of collateral, etc. So, you know, SMEs carry a bulk of the nation's economy as its backbone, and it is the most neglected area. And IFC's venture into SMEs, Nepal being part of the post-conflict fragile nation category, part of the Global SME Ventures program, identified that need. So, I mean, when we talk to our policymakers and our regulators, they always talk about the larger scenario, the big companies, the multi-million, billion-dollar hydropowers. But if you really want to develop a country really quickly, I think, and create large employment, I think it is the SME sector that needs to be given more focus. Now, I'd like to focus my question to Faris here, who was in Bolivia. Now, Bolivia is another nation which is quite similar to Nepal in terms of its geological location. It is landlocked. It is a small country. It is a socialist country like Nepal. What was the tipping point there, Faris? What is our tipping point in Nepal?
Yeah, testing, okay. Thank you. Well, it's hard, no, thanks very much for the question. I mean, it's hard to sort of, it's dangerous territory when one tries to compare one country with another, but certainly insofar as another country has some characteristics similar to Nepal, Bolivia would be one of them. It's also important to, how would I say, it's important to keep in mind that also Bolivia shares a border with Brazil, which is the biggest economy in Latin America, and second only, I think, to the US, so it's quite huge, and Mexico, so there, and Canada, of course. So there's a lot of similarities. I think the tipping point is, it's interesting, and this is, sorry, I keep going back to the same issue, and I think it's very important here in Nepal that, and this was mentioned yesterday in one of the speeches, that, you know, no country, nobody, certainly in this room, comes from a country that was built in a day. And that applies in the same way to an economy and economic structure. I think, you know, it would be very important to keep in mind that Bolivia's tipping point is yet to be defined. Bolivia has actually exited, in terms of the World Bank, from concessional financing to IBRD. Bolivia is actually now considered by many standards to be a middle-income country, having been the poorest. And the tipping point for Bolivia is one of these things where you cannot pick a specific date, a specific event, but it's actually a whole storyline, a whole string, a whole narrative over time of a constant sort of back and forth and a judicious balance between, and I think this is very important, between pushing for growth, sustainable growth, and shared prosperity. Bolivia is a country that has moved ahead, has led leaps and bounds, but at the same time sometimes has sacrificed growth for some social decisions in terms of distribution, whether it's social protection systems, whether it's labor employment schemes, etc. And I think this is what another similarity that Nepal has with it, in the sense that to actually, you know, to talk about the investment climate alone, I think is very important for people like us. And again, I do think that Nepal is now the right time if you're a frontier investor, you want to come for the long haul to come in. I think if you look at it from that side, it's very important, but you need to balance, our quest to get growth with the fact that growth sometimes comes at the expense of social inclusion and things of that sort. So I think in the case of Bolivia and Nepal, there is an effort to try to bring in growth. I think, and let me be very honest and very blunt here, it is nothing short of astonishing that we are talking about FDI and bringing in private investor with a government that has Communist Party in its title. And I think that is astonishing, and I have to consider that to be a very, very healthy sign. The issue is how to operationalize it. But I think what is really important, what happened in Bolivia, is nobody sat there and said, we must be successful today, we must be successful tomorrow, we must be successful in 2 years. I come from the US. We have, and here in Nepal, you're doing two things in parallel. You're trying to unveil or unfurl a new economic narrative, which is built on maximizing finance for development by bringing the private sector. And you're doing that in parallel with an absolutely profound paradigm shift, which is the creation of a new federal democratic republic. And you're doing that in parallel, right? So this, by its very nature, is not a proposition that will be done in a year, in 2 years, and 3 years. And I think all of us need to stop trying, and I'm not suggesting we are, but it's just taking advantage of it, to stop trying to measure Nepal's success in something we can measure in the next year, 2 or 3. This is something 10 years, 20 years from now we will look back on, as we have done for Bolivia, and then determine that the path was a success. I think it's very important. I myself come from the United States, country reaching its obviously hovering on the 3rd century of its federalism transition, and we still grapple with issues related to federalism. So I think we need to keep this narrative in sight, that Nepal, what's really important is for now we have a long-term investment horizon, which has not existed in the past. We have a long-term playground, a long-term ecosystem that is far from perfect but is changing. And one of the key resources that Nepal has not had in the past, which Bolivia had, and that now it has, is continuity, and I think horizon. And I think that is probably, from an investment perspective, I don't know if you agree or not, it's probably the biggest asset that you should be extracting now. And that requires that we all set our expectations and bring in money right now as soon as possible, because now the horizon is long and the investment and the payback period is much longer. Thank you.
Just to follow up on what you've just said, I just have a quick question for you. Nepal's track record on its macroeconomic indicators have been so far very positive, and hence has been an incredible, attractive nation for the multilaterals to give concessionary loans. I believe not too long ago, Nepal was provided grants by the World Bank, but no more. It's all concessionary loans because our economy has grown to that level. But having said that, the recent macroeconomic indicators show that we are on the decline. And, just around the corner is the investment summit. What is your perception that the investors would have towards Nepal under that context?
Thanks. No, that's, can you hear me? Can you hear me? Yeah. I mean, it's a very good question. I think I'm going to bore you to death today because I'm going to give you the same answer. It depends. You see, decline in what sense? If you look at the historic average, you've had pretty considerable GDP growth. Certainly in the past few years, 7.3, 6.9. This year, the bank is very conservative. I don't know what the ADB is estimating, but our very conservative figure is about 6%, which is quite considerable. The external sector is showing some pressures, obviously. You have balance of payment issue and things of that sort, and there's a concern on that you're basically importing more than you export. But again, evaluating whether this is a good thing or a bad thing is actually something you cannot take at one point in time. You have to look at the whole storyline. So if you break down this issue of imports, and you see that most of the imports are actually for capital goods, for machinery and spare parts, right? So if you want to build, you say you want to build Nepal, you want to get to growth, you want to, again, operationalize the federalism thing, which means you have 753 new governments. This is just the palikas that exist, so you have to bring in machinery, computers, things of that sort to unfold it. You also want to bring in the private sector, and private sector investors say, well, we need infrastructure to be in place. I'm not suggesting everything's rosy, right? But I'm just suggesting we take it into thing. So all of that requires the import of goods in order to make that happen. At the same time, whatever things, Nepal in terms of its export has a high import content factor, which means you actually have a lot of goods in your exportable stuff that needs to be imported. So if that creates a balance of payments, then I'd say good for you. Create more of a balance of payment deficit in the short term if it means that you're actually investing in future export capacity in the long term. So if the end result is just to consume and buy stuff that goes nowhere, then that's a bad thing. But if you're actually showing a deficit in terms of the export-import sort of gap, and that's going to capital goods, then actually I think that's a good place to be. So my answer is, as a typical economist, is depends.
Thank you for that positive note. Now, Bhoj Raj, moving forward in terms of project management, keeping in view of where the money's at, what has been your role towards investment? How you are advising, how you are, what you think should materialize for Nepal to attract that so elusive money in the future?
Thank you. It's working? Thank you, Sid. I think since the formation of this government, the government is trying to showcase Nepal in the global stage always as a market between two rising economies and vast markets, China and India. And there is, of course, a goodwill from across the globe, including development partners to Nepal. But the huge amount of money that comes to projects like Arun Third, Upper Karnali, Budi Gandaki, and other infrastructure projects such as airports that come from mainly China and India. Despite the economic scenario that we have, as Faris put forward, a very positive note on that, around the investment summit, if the government can assure investors from China and India that there will be some kind of policy certainty in next 5 and 10 years, then a lot of investors from these two markets, private investors, will be interested. Apart from that, Nepal has some niche products in terms of herbs, medicinal herbs, and if Nepal can find out those, it stays in the global value chain, its position in the global value chain, and Nepal has to promote that perspective so that we can invite investors from other countries. The question that how I am working with the government at the Ministry of Finance to attract the investment, there is a confusion among investors related to public-private partnership. And I believe the upcoming act related to public-private partnership and investment will clarify a whole lot of things. Particularly, government is, as far as I know, is trying to strengthen the capacity of investment board so that it can work autonomously with the investors, promoting Nepal's investment sectors, particularly infrastructures, physical infrastructures. And one point that I would like to add on that is the point, picking up the point from Faris, the 753 local governments, 7 provincial governments, and central government, they can work independently in terms of attracting domestic private investment. They can shape up their own policies and to some extent even provide incentives, even though provincial and local governments are not allowed to give concessions on income tax or all those things, but they can create a favorable environment to attract domestic investment in terms of infrastructure development that has the cross municipalities, cross provincial scopes.
Thank you very much. And you rightly said domestic investment is another indicator of how well we will be able to succeed in attracting foreign investment. May all the other provinces be as successful as province number 3 in terms of booking business in the future. And this is a point of introspection to see why is it that province number 3 is the highest. I mean, it is very skewed if you look at the number of industries that are being registered. Now, going to you, Aditi, we don't have much time left, but I'd like to ask about IFC's role in terms of moving forward, in terms of this investment summit. I know the IFC has been incredibly busy in terms of policy reform measures as well as advising, trying to get the reform measures in place. Can you sort of elaborate a bit on that?
The work that we're doing both on the policy level and to further investments, right? Thank you, Siddhant. I think it's a very important question. For Nepal to reach middle income status by 2030, we need $10 billion per annum in foreign direct investment. So there's still a lot of work that needs to be done. In terms of focus areas and priorities that we see, in terms of the policy side, it would be on getting more certainty, getting more clarity, and overcoming regulatory challenges from the policy side. For foreign investors to be attracted to do more business in Nepal, we definitely need to also overcome the infrastructure challenges. Skilled workforce is also a problem in Nepal. And as a foreign investor, one of the biggest challenges that I face on a daily basis is the forex controls and the forex risk management that we have trouble grappling with in Nepal. But I would also like to comment on some of the issues that we need to work with the private sector on as well. As foreign investors, we look for local partners, right? Local domestic partners as well. And the private sector, the local private sector here also needs to gear up for foreign investment if they want foreign partners. For example, in the environmental social governance standards, Nepali investors, are really lagging behind. So they need to step up. They need to also show commitment towards financial discipline to not engage in anti-competitive practices. So it's easy to just talk about the regulatory side of it, but the private sector also needs to step up.
Thank you. I'd like to add to that. ESG, environment, social governance issues, very important. And social environment management systems have to be in place. And IFC has facilitated a technical assistantship fund for companies that Business Oxygen has equity in, to make them along the lines meet international best standards. So that's another way that IFC has come and supported small and medium enterprises, so that the next round they will be open for investments from larger companies, hopefully coming in to inject equity in it. Now, back to you, Abhishek. There are a lot of risks involved in the journey towards where India has, especially in the IT sector. What were the mitigants? What are the risks that we in Nepal need to be aware of, bearing in mind the benefit of hindsight that you have?
So I think the risks whether in India or Nepal or anywhere else in the world are pretty much in the same categories, right? There is regulatory risk, there is policy risk. In business, we would love to have the government just step aside and let us be, but that doesn't happen, right? And I think the way to control for that is to have communication with the government. So, and the governments need to talk to entrepreneurs, talk to whether it's in IT, healthcare, education, to know what's happening, right? So if you followed Indian media recently, there's been a big controversy with angel tax, right? A lot of startups started getting income tax notices for raising capital, right? Because in its wisdom, the department thought this is income, not equity investment, right? That happened because there was a gap. Because those tax officers didn't actually communicate with anyone this side of the fence within the industry. It has changed in India a lot, and obviously not everywhere, not in every department, but we have had senior executives from large companies now working in the government, right? Nandan is a big example, the biggest example of that. He started Aadhaar, but even with SIDBI, the $10 billion fund for startups is being handled partly by private individuals, as in they're part of the board, which decides on investments. So for the government, I think that change, which is private sector, people from the private sector and entrepreneurs working in the government or with the government, has been a very big advantage in the last 10 years especially. Beyond that, I think, yes, macro risks will remain. If you're in business, you have to be ready for that, right? There are external factors which you can't control for. Tomorrow, if there's a conflict on our borders, we can't predict that, right? We can't even fix it. But I think as long as you grow, as long as you just try to achieve scale in any business, capital will come, right? We saw that in India. I think the first time I started raising capital, first time I did an investment round, we raised, I think it was 100 crores, right? It was 14 years ago, right? So $15 million. And it was a huge amount for us. It was a different sector, it was in media, but we were so excited about it. But 3 years ago, we were doing deals of $500 million, and it doesn't feel that large. It didn't happen overnight. It took a decade or so for that to happen, for us to start getting these amounts into India. And I think the lessons for us were work with the government, and the government should work with the private sector. Policies shouldn't be made in isolation. Yes, IFC, World Bank kind of organizations do discuss with the government, but I think the government needs to involve private sector. They need to involve entrepreneurs in these discussions. And then I don't think there would be any issue. I think there would be those usual issues. In India, we are still getting notices, right, from the income tax department. So those will happen. But because there is consultation, that issue also, the latest one, has been handled, right? It's been controlled for. There has been no damage. And unless there is consultation, communication, both sides, it will be a problem.
Referring to the angel investors being taxed?
Actually, it's not them. It's the companies which receive funding, because they were being funded at a very high premium. And so this is private investment, right? You can't calculate the share value and invest at that, because then it won't be any, then you can't raise large amounts. So they had to be told that this is how we do investments, this is how we raise capital. And so it's okay now. But yeah, there was a period of 2 or 3 months when there was a lot of uncertainty, investments had stopped, even in India, and you could fix it because we knew who to talk to, right? And they knew who to listen to or who to discuss with. So people like Nandan and Mohandas, people who are working with the government, are doing a great job on that front.
Thank you. And there's a lesson to be learned here. I mean, I think the private sector needs to be heard by the policymakers, and the private sector has to work with the POP. They have to be in sync with each other. Okay, now I think we are at the fag end of our discourse here, and we're going to open up the floor for questions. You have to go through the app, go to this session, tap into that, and there is a section, I think a section that says Q&A. So we already have several questions already, so I'm going to start reading some of them to you. The first one, we'll see who can answer the question the best. We hear a lot about high volume deals, and these are important, but curious to hear perspectives on direct investment programs that target technology-enabled high-tech companies. Are any in the pipeline, especially targeting companies that are at the ideation and or pre-revenue stages, possibly utilizing a PPP approach? Okay. The second question will go about 2 by 2. With more control and intervention coming in form of regulations, and with many legal hindrances in form of legal procedure, it is very hard for the investor to even think of investing in Nepal. Moreover, with the high corruption from the policy level, how can we maintain integrity of Nepal as a potential country for foreign investment? Now, let's take these 2 questions. Who would like to answer the first one? I think Aditi, can you? Yeah, please.
The first one, a lot of it pertains to SMEs, right? Which I've already answered, so I won't really delve into that more. But maybe on the IT sector, I will expand it a little bit as well. It's not just the IT sector that DFIs and other foreign investors are looking at. IFC is also considering a few fintech investments as we speak. But interestingly, we looked at sectors other than infrastructure and financial services, of course. The World Bank Group together, World Bank and IFC, we recently came up with a country private sector diagnostic reports where we looked at the smaller sort of investment opportunities as well, which have potential to really change the growth trajectory of the country. We looked at agribusiness, tourism, IT services, and health and education. Health and education also, that would also touch upon the PPP angle, where the private sector can work with the government on, service delivery on some areas like technical and vocational education, for example, right, which are sort of more the enabling sectors. In terms of tourism, doesn't necessarily have to be huge tourism projects that we're talking about. We're talking about nature-based, cultural, religious products, right, in tourism, and it could be SMEs as well. In agribusiness, we're again talking about niche products. We're talking about, unleashing the potential of Nepal in terms of the diverse agroclimatic conditions that we have. That's another area that we looked at. And interestingly, the final sector, the IT services sector, you've touched upon it quite a bit as well already. Given Nepal's young workforce, the fact that our median age is 23, there's a lot we can be doing. Our mobile penetration, internet penetration is one of the highest in the region. So there's a lot of potential there as well.
Can I add something? Thank you very much. Just to complement what Aditi is saying with a little bit, I think that's entirely correct, and obviously we're both part of the same World Bank group. So I think, going back to the question, this issue on the IT digital economy, I think there is a lot of stuff that needs to be happen, which is very active, sort of actively promoting these ones. But let's not forget the passive part, which is, and maybe this is where I betray my very market-oriented biases, where we can target these things, but we should look at the overall sort of ecosystem for any investor to come. So part of it is looking at these sectors, but then looking at what kind of ecosystem, what kind of bedrock does Nepal have. And the reality is, many people, and again, this is me being very open, with the exception of very few investors that currently exist in Nepal, incumbents, have access to finance so they can open new business. So when we talk about the private sector, we're not just talking about making the existing successful businesses even more successful, but getting all these young entrepreneurs, all these other entrepreneurs who want to come in who don't have access to finance. Just to give you some data that's very important. When we were looking at this, in terms of need for better long-term access to long-term finances. And there were some surveys that were done. 40% of the private sector see access to finance as the #1 constraint why they're not opening a business here. And this applies to IT, to everybody. The financial sector is dominated by the banks. Banks are 87% of financial assets in Nepal. So you have a huge issues. It's very difficult. The stock market needs modernization, and the banking sector and financial institutions account for 80% of the stock market. So the issue is, I agree with Aditi, we need to do all of this, but we really need to look at, in a very blind and asexual way, in the sense of sectors, you know what I mean, a gender-neutral way, irrespective of any sector. What are the binding constraints to long-term access to finance? Once we build that, then you, myself, Aditi, nobody should be in the business of determining which sectors should emerge. We should let the market come in.
Thank you. The second question on corruption, who would like to take it?
I would like to add one point complementing what Faris said, that in terms of finance and finding where is the money, that what I'm hopeful is that once the Debt Management Act that the central government comes up with and endorsed from the parliament, provincial government and local government will have a foundation for them to operate in the capital market, including central government. That will help us to increase the debt ratio to GDP, which is just 25% at the moment, can go up to 40-45% without disturbing the fiscal stability. Going to the question of the corruption, legal process and all that, we have to look forward because we are at this juncture, and I know we have been saying this since the beginning of the constitution new constitution promulgation date. But from this point onward, I think I'm really hopeful about the act, that not only because I was engaged while drafting it, but also because it will enable investment board to another level, which will build a scenario where one window service for the investors will be established, having officials from different line ministries or different institutions in one place. The second is there will be a operational mechanism within the investment board office where investors and the domestic investors, foreign investors will have different windows to go and get their approval in a faster pace than used to happen before. The case of corruption, as we know, that the doing business climate is bleaker compared to last year, and we have a corruption index going higher. But these things take time. But at the same time, once we have a private sector crowding in the country, then there will be a force that will make public sector to be competent and not be not have a rent-seeking mentality. And in this, from this perspective, the country can attract foreign investors and mobilize the domestic investment.
Okay. Now, someone has to answer the corruption question. Anyone? The question, I'll repeat again, is, with more control and intervention coming to in form of regulation and with many legal hindrances, it is very hard for the investor to even think about investing in Nepal. Moreover, with the high corruption from the policy level, how can we maintain integrity of Nepal as a potential country for foreign investment? Anyone?
I don't want to dominate. I'm happy to answer the risky question.
There are a lot of questions directed to you, Faris, here, so we don't have time for all that, so maybe, but go ahead, why don't you? I think it's very important because...
So the reality is, obviously goes without saying that as the World Bank, we think that corruption itself is something that is inimical, that is antithetical to development, right? The reality is, if you look at the data, it is possible to have corrupt ecosystems where you still have investment. So, and I hate to say that, but the problem is, if you look at the payback periods, the types of investments you see in these areas, they're investments with very low payback periods. They usually do not engage in actual investment in infrastructure, in putting in place something in the investment destination, and it's about extracting of resource very quickly. So in reality, you can choose the hard way, which is to tackle this in order to bring in the right investment with the right payback period, or you can do it the easy way and just bring in investments now, which is usually sometimes even facilitated by these lack of transparencies. But ultimately, they will not going to lead to investment in know-how and technical skills, and there's a lot of studies to show a direct correlation between the transparency and the long-term payback period investment. So insofar as Nepal will rely on this investment to thrust it into middle income status, this has to be longer payback period investment. So by its very nature, it brings in the right money, the right know-how, etc. And I would still say that these policies, everything, and very happy to have the honorable ministers here. This is something we've discussed, I think are necessary and a very important bedrock for Nepal's new economic storyline. They're very important. Now, what needs to be built upon this bedrock are actually 2 or 3 or 4 key facts on the ground, precedents. You know, this is one of these things where you're sort of governed by both Latin law and common law. Latin law creates the framework, but common law creates facts on the ground and precedents of key successful investments that have been documented, that have gone from A to Z. And with that, I still think there's a huge pent-up demand for investment in Nepal as a frontier destination that can be realized very soon. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, one last question before we run out of time here. It's addressed to you, Aditi. It says, what's the perception of IFC and World Bank towards social entrepreneurship? As Nepal has come out of transition period, strengthening the social structure is equally important. Is there any support for social entrepreneurs, since it does not return back as regular business, but it does strengthen the base? I have a dream to do so, but we do need numerous support on the path. Could we be hopeful, particularly from this sector, that there is money?
So I don't know if a lot of people here know, but IFC has two departments, two units, investment and advisory services. Now the investment services is clearly sort of directed towards commercial sort of payback as well, right? So we need to keep both the development goals and the commercial aspects in mind while doing the investment services. But in terms of advisory, we can definitely work with social enterprises as well. Like I said earlier, environmental, social governance, and sustainability is at the core of everything we do. So we definitely have room to work with social enterprises as well.
Okay, thank you. Now, just want to wrap up the session with a little brief on what was discussed. If you look at the panelists, you'll see that majority of them are all from the DFIs, Development Finance Institution, and we're talking about money. So hopefully next year when we do have this panel discussion, it will be the other side. We'd have more people from the private sector talking about money and not just the DFIs. And that's because the DFIs are attuned with the risk factors that countries like Nepal have, post-conflict fragile nations, and they are willing to be the first entrance to this frontier. And the onus is on us to prove to the world that Nepal is ready for business with the seed capital that the DFIs have provided so far. In conclusion, it looks like we're on a positive track. We need that tipping point. Hopefully there will be, those reform measures will be passed by the investment summit so that we will see that there will be enormous interest in Nepal and that the investors will come in hordes. Having said that, let's hope for the best. Nepal's on the right path forward, and we should be all optimistic about that. And with that, I think we don't want to take any more time from the next session. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Siddhant Pandey, and to all our panelists for this session on where they discussed where is the money and tried to find out where exactly the money is. They also discussed that there is money and the ways in which we can definitely attract that money and bring that money in our country as well.
The Kantipur